Sometimes, the people who hurt you the most share your last name. And sometimes, the pain doesn't come from shouting, but from silence. From a seat that's no longer saved for you. This is the story of how I learned that being family isn't always enough. If you've ever felt forgotten, pushed aside, or quietly betrayed by the ones you love most, this story is for you. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to their family stories. Like this video if it touches something in you. And leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, let me take you back to the night my brother looked me in the eye, smirked, and said, "This table's for family only." I remember holding the fork for a while. I didn't eat. I wasn't hungry. Funny how shame sits heavier in your stomach than any meal could. From where I sat, I could see them all. Mark, carving his steak like he owned the world. My mother, sipping her wine like nothing had happened. And Aunt Clara, she caught my eye once, then looked away just as fast. It wasn't the words that cut me. It was what they meant. My brother didn't say I wasn't family. But he didn't have to. I'd spent years trying to forget the feeling of being second place. The overlooked one. The one you only remembered when you needed a ride, a loan, or a favor. I thought maybe, just maybe, things would feel different now that Dad was gone. That somehow, in his absence, we'd pull closer together. But it turns out, some families tighten their circles when grief hits. And they push others out without so much as blinking. I looked down at the glass of water in front of me. My fingers tracing a ring of condensation around the base. My reflection shimmered on the surface, tired eyes. Hair pulled back in a rush. The dress I'd worn for Dad's funeral still hanging in soft folds. I thought of Dad in those last months. How small he'd become. How he used to smile every time I brought him his evening tea. Even when he couldn't speak anymore. How his hand would grip mine. Just barely, like a whisper of thank you. Mark hadn't visited once. Not even for 10 minutes. And yet there he was. Telling stories at the head of the table. Holding court like some grieving prince. My mother nodded along, dabbing at her eyes whenever anyone looked. They hadn't seen Dad cry in the dark. When his pain got too much and the pills weren't enough. They hadn't cleaned the blood when the coughing started. They hadn't bathed him, clothed him, sat with him through the silence. I had. Every time I clocked out of my hospice shift, I'd go straight to him. For 2 years, no complaints, no recognition, just me, my car, and the man who once called me his little star. And now, at the first family dinner after his death, I was seated next to a swinging kitchen door. The waitress brought my plate. I whispered thanks and poked at it for a while. My hands felt too heavy to lift a fork. A loud laugh from the main table made me flinch. It was Mark again, laughing at something ridiculous. Probably a memory that he'd rewritten to make himself a hero. I'd heard him do it before. It's strange how grief works. It strips people down. Some crumble, others pretend. Some, like me, just sit quietly, waiting for a sign that maybe, just maybe, someone still sees them. I kept thinking someone would say something. Maybe Mom would call my name. Maybe Jenna would scoot over and whisper, "Come sit with us." But no one moved. And slowly, I realized, no one would. Whatever they saw when they looked at me, it wasn't family anymore. Maybe it never was. But I didn't leave, not yet. Because I knew something none of them did. Something that was about to change everything. I glanced at my purse, where a sealed envelope rested between my wallet and my worn-out lip balm. It had arrived that morning, hand-delivered by Dad's lawyer. And it held his final words. I kept glancing at the envelope in my bag. But I didn't take it out. Not yet. There's a kind of weight to things left unsaid. Like fog that settles in your chest, making it hard to breathe. That's what that dinner felt like. Tight. Airless. Full of ghosts nobody wanted to acknowledge. Mark kept talking like he was the only one who'd known Dad. "You remember when Dad taught me to drive that old Ford truck?" he said. Grinning wide, took it out and nearly crashed it into the grain silo. Man, he was so mad, but he still handed me the keys again the next day. They all laughed. Except me. Because I remembered that day. I remembered the keys weren't handed back out of trust, but out of exhaustion. Dad had just come back from the hospital. He'd been too tired to argue. I also remembered how he'd called me that night. Voice raspy, asking if I could pick up his medication. Said he didn't want to ask Mark again. But I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct the story. I just watched. People believe what they want to believe. Especially when the truth is inconvenient. I wasn't always this quiet. As a kid, I used to be bright. Talkative. I loved to sing. Especially in the kitchen while Mom cooked. She used to hush me. Said it gave her a headache. Mark, though, he could bang on pots and tell jokes and get applauded for it. I learned early that attention came with rules. That love, in our house, had a pecking order, and I was somewhere near the bottom. Still, I stayed. I did my part. When Mark got promoted and moved to Chicago, I stayed in Des Moines. When Mom slipped a disc, I drove her to every appointment. When Dad's memory started to go, I rearranged my schedule so I could be there after work. Not because anyone asked, but because it was the right thing to do. Some people wear their sacrifice like a badge. I wore mine like a second skin, quiet, invisible, and expected. 2 winters ago, when the doctors said Dad would need round-the-clock care, Mark suggested a home, said it'd be more efficient. Mom didn't say much. She looked at me. Not a request, just a pause, like she knew I'd say yes before the question left her mouth. So I did. I moved him into my apartment. Bought a special bed with money I'd been saving for a trip to Oregon. Cancelled the trip. I told myself there'd be time later. Funny how, later, always seems to belong to someone else. Dad was quiet most days. Sometimes he forgot who I was. But once in a while, he'd squeeze my hand and call me, kiddo. Just like he used to when I'd fall asleep on the couch watching westerns with him. And even when he couldn't speak at all, I could feel it, the way he looked at me. Grateful, present. That was the only kind of thanks I ever needed. Until tonight. Until I saw the way they all let me sit alone. The way they ignored the very years that had cost me sleep, money, and parts of myself I'd never get back. Aunt Clara was now passing a bowl of roasted potatoes. Someone cracked a joke about Dad's old recliner. Mark raised his glass. To Dad, he said. And that was when the door opened. A tall man in a gray wool coat stepped into the dining room. His hair was white at the temples. And his expression was unreadable. He paused just inside the room, letting the door close behind him. I recognized him instantly. James Kessler, Dad's lawyer. Mark stood, cheerful. James, you made it. Thought you couldn't come. Mr. Kessler nodded politely but didn't smile. I wasn't planning to, but your father asked that I be here. There was a hush. He reached into his coat and pulled out a manila folder. And I knew, without needing to hear another word, that the night had just shifted. Everyone sat straighter. You could feel it, the sudden change in the room. The kind of quiet that falls when people realize the show they've been performing might not end the way they expected. Mark motioned to the empty chair beside him. Have a seat, James. We were just reminiscing. But Mr. Kessler didn't move. Instead, he glanced around the room. Then let his eyes settle briefly on me. Just long enough for me to know, he hadn't come for Mark. He cleared his throat. Your father left instructions for a personal letter to be delivered this evening. He asked that I read it. In front of the family. I watched Mark's face twitch. Just slightly. He masked it quickly. That flicker of surprise. But it was there. He leaned back, draping his arm over the back of his chair like he was hosting a game show. Of course. Please. Go ahead. The room fell completely silent. Even the servers seemed to disappear. Mr. Kessler opened the folder slowly. Like he wasn't just revealing paper but something heavier. I could see my father's handwriting through the thin envelope, slanted. Deliberate. A little shaky in places. He slipped the single page from the envelope and began to read. To my family. If you're hearing this, then I'm gone. I'm not a man who liked ceremony. But there are a few things that should be said. Truths that were never easy to speak while I was alive. First, to Mark. You've built a good life. You're strong-willed, ambitious, and full of charm. But you were not there when it counted. And charm fades in the dark. Mark sat up a little. A tight smile playing at his lips like he didn't know whether to laugh or object. You gave me words, but your sister gave me time. Julia gave me comfort, presence, dignity. She gave me something a father does not forget, not when he can't stand. Not when he can't feed himself. Not when the world grows small and every day feels borrowed. To my daughter, I don't have enough words for what you've done. You never asked for anything. But I've seen it all. I've felt it. Which is why, with the help of Mr. Kessler, I've updated my wishes accordingly. The house, my accounts, and all personal belongings, go to Julia. I trust she'll know what to do with them. Mark, you receive this message instead. I raised a son, but Julia made me a man worth remembering. Mr. Kessler folded the letter with the same reverence you'd give to a flag at a soldier's funeral. Then he looked up. Silence. I couldn't breathe for a moment. Not because I was shocked. Not because I wanted the things Dad left me. But because, he saw me. He really saw me. All those nights I wondered if he even knew it was me feeding him. Washing his face. Brushing his hair, he knew. Mark's face had gone red. His mouth opened, then closed. Mom looked like someone had tipped her chair backwards and she wasn't sure whether to scream or hold her breath. Aunt Clara gasped. Actually gasped. Like someone in an old drama film. It should have felt like a victory. But mostly, it felt, still, like a tide going out. Mark stood slowly. This is ridiculous. He muttered. He must have been confused. He was on medication. Julia, you manipulated him. He didn't know what he was saying. I stood, not to argue, but because I was tired of sitting alone. I picked up my purse. Took one last glance at the people who'd chosen their comfort over my presence. And spoke in a voice that surprised even me. I never needed the house. I said, or the money. I just wanted a seat at the table. Then I turned, and walked out. Behind me, I heard nothing. No one called my name. And for once, it didn't hurt. Because I wasn't walking away empty-handed. I was carrying something they'd never given me. Acknowledgement. Peace. And the quiet strength of being seen. The night air outside was colder than I remembered. Or maybe it just felt that way because my skin still burned from the heat of that room, the glares. The silence. The old wounds tearing open like pages in a forgotten book. I didn't go straight home. I drove aimlessly for a while, letting the quiet of the road soak into my bones. The city looked different at night. Older, somehow, like it was finally showing its real face. Stripped of daylight pleasantries and small talk. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My mascara had smudged at the corners. My lips looked pale, but there was something new in my eyes. Something I hadn't seen in a long time. Not anger, not even sadness. Just, release. I ended up in front of Dad's house without thinking. My car just knew the way. The porch light was still on. I hadn't changed the timer. I stood on the steps for a while, keys in hand, looking at the door. This house had been ours since I was 7. Every summer barbecue, every Christmas argument, every scraped knee and late night talk. It was all in there. Pressed into the walls like fingerprints. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled like dust and wood polish. Familiar, safe, in its own quiet way. I left the lights off and walked to the living room. The recliner was still there. The one Dad refused to replace. Even when the springs gave out and the fabric started to split along the seams. I sat in it, slowly, feeling the worn leather give beneath me. That's when the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, just a few. Quiet streaks down my cheeks as I leaned my head back and let it all come loose. It wasn't just tonight. It was every time I'd swallowed my pride. Every holiday card signed, Love, Mark and family, while I got a plain text message. Every missed birthday. Every time I was the last one told about a gathering, if I was told at all. And yet, I stayed. I answered the phone when Mom needed her meds picked up. I drove 3 hours when Mark's wife had a scare during her pregnancy. I even babysat their kids so they could go on vacation. I never asked for anything back. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe people stop valuing what's always given freely. I didn't sleep much that night. Just dozed in the chair, waking every so often to the creak of the house settling or the wind brushing the windows. Morning came with a gray sky and a thin drizzle. I made coffee, black and strong, the way Dad used to drink it. Sat at the kitchen table, fingers curled around the mug, watching the steam rise. That's when I made the decision. I wasn't going to keep the house. Not because I was angry. Not out of spite. Because holding on to places where you were only ever tolerated, it keeps you small. It ties you to the version of yourself that waited for scraps. For invitations. For a kind word that never came. I called Mr. Kessler that afternoon. Told him I wanted to sell. Not rushed, just with intention. He didn't sound surprised. Said he'd handle it quietly. I went room by room over the next few weeks, packing what little I wanted to keep. Dad's old records, a framed photo of us fishing at Gray's Lake. His wristwatch, still ticking, tucked into his bedside drawer. Everything else, I donated. Gave the furniture to a shelter. The books to the library. I wanted that house to hold someone else's memories. Someone who'd fill it with noise and warmth and family that didn't have to be earned. I moved into a small place closer to the hospice. Nothing fancy, just mine. My coworkers threw me a little dinner one night, potluck style. Nothing extravagant, but when I walked in, there was a seat saved for me. A chair in the center of the table, with a card that said, Julia, and I cried. Because that's what love looks like. Doesn't it? Not grand gestures or inheritance papers. Just a name, written down. There's something sacred about starting over when you're not young anymore. When the world no longer expects you to bloom. People talk a lot about fresh starts. But they rarely talk about how much it hurts to let go of the garden you tended for years. Even when it never bore fruit. The first few weeks in the new place felt strange. Quiet, but not the kind I was used to. It wasn't lonely, just unfamiliar. No hum of Dad's oxygen machine. No squeaky floorboard outside the bedroom where I used to pause, listening for signs he needed me. Just me, a second-hand couch, and a calendar that finally had space for my name. I'd hung the photo of us fishing in the hallway. It wasn't a great picture. Dad's hat was too big for his head and I had a mosquito bite right between my eyebrows. But it was the only one where we looked happy without trying. That mattered more than anything. I didn't tell Mark or Mom I was selling the house. I figured they'd hear about it eventually. Small towns always talk. Besides, what was there to say? The only time I heard from Mark was 2 weeks later. A short, clipped voicemail. Just heard about the house. Call me back. I didn't. There was no anger left in me to fuel a conversation. I didn't need him to understand. I didn't need anyone to understand. For the first time, I wasn't doing things to keep the peace. I wasn't keeping my voice soft so others wouldn't flinch. I wasn't folding myself smaller to make room for someone else's comfort. I had spent years trading my presence for acceptance. Now, I simply walked away. At work, I found a rhythm again. My patients never asked about my personal life. And I didn't offer. But I started spending a little more time in the break room. Stayed after my shift for coffee with Marlene, who'd been a nurse even longer than me. We talked about old movies and baking disasters, and once, after a long day, she asked if I wanted to join her family for dinner that weekend. I almost said no out of habit. But then I remembered the way my name looked on that card at the hospice potluck. Julia, in someone's handwriting, a seat waiting. So I said yes. Dinner was noisy and warm. The kind of chaos that used to make me anxious. Kids talking over each other. A dog sneaking scraps under the table. Mismatched plates and second servings. At one point, Marlene's granddaughter handed me a crayon drawing with Miss Jolleeya written in giant block letters across the top. I laughed. I hadn't laughed like that in months. That night, I sat in my car a long time before driving home. I thought about all the tables I'd been left out of. All the conversations that kept going without me. The weddings, the birthdays, the holidays where my chair was either forgotten or filled by someone else. And yet, I wasn't bitter. Not anymore. I was beginning to see something I'd missed all those years. Being left out of their story had allowed me to write my own. The story of a woman who gave everything without asking. And finally learned that love doesn't require suffering. That being chosen isn't the same as being tolerated. That showing up for others doesn't mean you owe them your silence when they erase you. And most of all, that a table isn't holy just because your blood sits around it. Sometimes, The most sacred tables are the ones you build yourself. With people who see you, not just need you. One evening, I got a call from Mr. Kessler. The house had sold. A young couple with a baby on the way. He said they loved the big backyard and the creaky porch swing. I think your father would have liked them, he said. I smiled, staring out the window. The world was quiet again. But it didn't feel empty. It was a Sunday morning. Barely past 8. I'd just made a cup of tea and sat down with a worn book I'd read a dozen times. The kind that feels more like a friend than a story. A knock rattled the front door, firm. Insistent. I knew before I opened it. He stood there in a dark coat. The same one he wore at Dad's memorial. Though now it looked too stiff. Too heavy for the mild spring air. I didn't say anything. Just stepped aside and let him in. He walked past me without a greeting. Looked around the modest living room like he'd walked into a stranger's home. His eyes flicked to the photo on the wall, me and Dad at Gray's Lake. He stared at it for a long moment. Then turned back to me. You should have told me, he said. I tilted my head. Told you what? That Dad changed the will. That he left everything to you. I set my tea down carefully. It wasn't my decision to share. He laughed. But there wasn't any humor in it. Come on, Julia. You knew what that letter would do. You could have warned me. Prepared the family. Instead, you let it play out like some scene. It was the word scene that got me. As if what happened at that dinner was some performance I orchestrated. Not the fallout of years he chose not to look at. I didn't ask for any of it. I said, voice calm. Not the house. Not the money. Not even that letter. What I wanted, what I've always wanted, was just to be treated like I mattered. That table, that seat. I didn't need your permission. Mark, I'm his daughter. Just like you're his son. He shifted, suddenly uncomfortable. You made me look like a monster. I didn't answer right away. I watched him. This man who had once held my hand walking home from school. Who used to call me, Jules, when no one else was listening. Somewhere between then and now, something had hardened in him. Or maybe it had always been there. And I just stopped squinting past it. You looked like yourself, I finally said. That's what hurt. He didn't like that. His jaw clenched. I could see the words forming behind his teeth. The arguments, the excuses, the justifications. But none of them came out. Instead, he sat down, right there on the edge of my couch. Like he didn't know what to do with his own body. I didn't know he was that sick. He muttered, you didn't ask. Silence filled the room again. Not the heavy kind like at the dinner. But the still kind, the kind that lets things settle. I thought I was the one he counted on. He said after a while. He always acted like I had to lead the family. That I had to be the example. And I was the support. I said, the one who quietly held things together so no one else had to notice the cracks. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw a flicker of something real in his eyes. Not guilt, not pride, just truth. You really took care of him, didn't you? I did. He nodded, slowly. Thank you. It wasn't enough to fix everything. But it was something. A start. Mark stood after that, as if staying any longer might expose too much of him. He walked to the door. Paused with his hand on the knob. I didn't mean for you to feel left out. He said. That night, it wasn't planned. It just happened. Most damage does. I said softly. He looked down. Take care, Julia. Then he left. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel sad. I just sat there with my tea, now cold, and watched the steam that wasn't rising anymore. Sometimes closure doesn't come with apologies or grand gestures. Sometimes it's just a door closing. And the quiet that follows when you don't chase after it. Life went on. It always does. In the quiet way life has of reminding you that no matter how loud the heartbreak, the world keeps spinning. I didn't hear from Mark again. Not after that morning. No calls. No messages. And strangely, I didn't miss them. Not in the way I used to. There was a time I'd ache for a text from him. Or a call from Mom. Even if it came with criticism tucked between pleasantries. But now, I'd learned how to breathe without waiting for anyone else's air. At the hospice, things got busier. We admitted a woman named Mrs. Lowell. 84, sharp as a tack, and utterly unafraid of dying. She reminded me of Dad in her quieter moments, the same distant stare. Like she was already talking to people we couldn't see. One night, after the other nurses had gone home, she asked if I'd sit with her. Just sit, no talking. I pulled up a chair beside her bed. And we stayed that way for almost an hour. At some point, she reached for my hand. And I gave it. She looked over and smiled. "You're someone's daughter," she said, almost like a question. I nodded. "I am. That someone new piece," she whispered. I didn't speak, because anything I could have said would have cracked the moment. When she passed the next morning, I washed her face gently and tied her hair back the way she liked. That afternoon, I walked through the garden behind the hospice, the one I'd helped plant years ago, and saw the first shoots of daffodils coming up through the soil. Little green blades pushing through winter's memory. I stood there a long time, watching them. Grief doesn't go away, I've learned. It just changes shape. It stops being a wave that knocks you down and becomes more like a low tide. You still feel it pulling at your ankles, but you learn how to walk through it. I visit Dad's grave sometimes. I bring coffee. He never did like flowers much. I sit on the bench and talk to him, not out loud, but the kind of talking that happens in the spaces between breaths. I tell him about my patients, about the new family I'm building, slowly, gently. There's a man I've been seeing now and then. Nothing serious yet, just coffee, a movie, shared silence that doesn't ask for anything more than company. He knows about my past. He doesn't try to fix it. That's enough for now. Last Christmas, Marlene invited me back again. This time, I brought a pie. When I walked in, one of her grandsons shouted, "Julia's here," like I was someone worth announcing. There was a seat for me at the table, same chair as last year. Same place. Someone had made a little name card again. The corners were crooked. The marker bled a little. But there it was. My name. Waiting. We said grace. Passed the plates. People asked about my work. Listened. Laughed. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And at one point, between bites of sweet potato casserole and stories I'd already heard twice, I realized something that filled my chest in a way I hadn't known I needed. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for recognition. Not for inclusion. Not for some overdue apology. I had stopped knocking on the doors of people who'd made it clear they didn't want to let me in. Instead, I'd built something quieter. Something smaller. But stronger. It's funny how one sentence, "This table's for family only," can cut so deep. But now, I see it for what it was. An invitation to find a new table. One where my name isn't questioned. One where love isn't earned through silence and sacrifice. One where I belong, not because of blood, but because of grace. So yes, maybe I stood up that night in humiliation. But I walked out in power. And I never looked back.